hearing, our country would be a much different place. Shocking stuff. Thanks for your tweets. Use the hashtag IRS to offer your thoughts. The House is about to gavel in. Members this afternoon beginning with work on a bill dealing with assistance for victims of sexual assault in the military. A little bit later, work on the 12 bills that keep the federal government operating, starting with the Military Construction and VA Benefits Bill, and then Homeland Security appropriations. Live coverage now of the U.S. House here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Sadhguru Bodhinatha Veeranswamy from the Kauai Adhinam Hindu Monastery, Kauai, Hawaii.
May today's session of the House of Representatives, to which Americans rightly turn for leadership, be abundantly blessed by the Lord Supreme. Through personal introspection, a collaborative heart, and by God's all-pervasive grace, may the members present here today, despite differing views and staunchly held convictions, find the wisdom to craft mutually acceptable solutions to our nation's challenges. The tragic Boston Marathon bombings, still vivid in all of our minds, implore us to advocate the humanity of a nonviolent approach in all dimensions of life. Hindu scripture declares, without equivocation, that the highest of high ideals is to never knowingly harm anyone. May we here in this chamber, and all the people of our great nation, endeavor to face even our greatest difficulties with an unwavering commitment to seek out and find nonviolent solutions. Peace, peace, peace to us, and peace to all beings.
The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House's approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and I are proud to have the opportunity to welcome Sadhguru Bodhinatha, the spiritual leader and head of Kauai's Hindu monastery. He has come here today to give the opening prayer on the Hindu American Foundation's 10th annual Capitol Hill Advocacy Day, and he is a true leader in the Hindu community. Sadhguru has been the head of the monastery since 2001 and works to spread the principles of peace and inclusiveness around the community. Additionally, his achievements have international reach. Not only does he oversee the Himalayan Academy's various publications, he serves as a publisher of the international magazine Hinduism Today. Furthermore, Sadhguru dedicates his time to cultivating the religious instruction of Hindu youth around the world through producing a series of books that reach Hinduism's ethical restraints, that teach those restraints and teach religious observances as well. Thank you, Sadhguru, for your opening prayer.
The Chair will entertain 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition? Does the gentleman from Arkansas seek unanimous consent? Yes. The gentleman is recognized.
Today, on behalf of a grateful state, I rise to honor Scott County Sheriff Cody Carpenter and Arkansas Game and Fish Wildlife Officer Joel Campora, who died heroically last week trying to save their fellow Arkansans from flash floods. Sheriff Carpenter leaves behind a wife and 4 children. Officer Campora leaves behind a wife and 2 daughters. Along with my fellow Arkansans, I want to express my deepest condolences to their families, their communities, and their brothers and sisters in law enforcement. But even as we mourn their deaths and console their loved ones, let us also honor their sacrifice and courage. Sheriff Carpenter and Officer Campora died in the line of duty, protecting their fellow citizens. John 15:13 says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." These men volunteered for duty that can call for that ultimate sacrifice every day. Now that they have laid down their lives, I join my state and my country in mourning and celebrating their cherished memory.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it has now been 884 days. No serious jobs bill yet. I'm proud to announce a powerful alternative to this shameful inaction. Today, I'm again introducing the Jobs Now Act, a bill that would give local officials the resources and flexibility they need to retain, hire, and train workers immediately. If this sounds like some left-wing idea, I ask you to consider who served as the key initiator and advocate for the CETA program on which this legislation is based. President Richard Milhouse Nixon. I have no doubt that many of the Americans hearing me today benefited either directly or indirectly from CETA. Mr. Speaker, let's return to the days when investing in job creation and human potential was a bipartisan cause. Let's bring this important bill to the floor for a vote. Our mantra in this Congress should be jobs, jobs, jobs.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the national debt reached an unprecedented record of over $16.85 trillion. Such a figure is so mind-boggling that I will make this simple. This means that every person in the United States now owes $53,329 to pay down the debt, and every U.S. taxpayer's debt share is now $148,186. With the debt at such high levels, it is not surprising that we are still experiencing an anemic 2% growth rate, which has produced the lowest job participation rate in 30 years. The ever-rising public debt threatens to drive up interest rates, crowd out private investment, and increase inflation. The implications will be severe and pronounced for all Americans, but most especially for the poor, the elderly, and the middle class. Mr. Speaker, if we don't deal with the debt now, the debt will deal with us. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Without objection, gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, last month we saw 2 bridges in this country collapse in 1 week. If that fact doesn't get us to act, maybe this one will. According to the Federal Highway Administration, over 70,000 bridges nationwide have been deemed structurally deficient. That's 1 in 9 bridges. Congress can't continue to kick this can down the road on this critical issue. That's why I've called on my colleagues on the Transportation Committee to hold hearings to focus on the state of our nation's bridges. Last week, we had the Special Freight Transportation Panel in Southern California on a 3-day fact-finding trip to see how businesses rely on our transportation arteries, bridges, highways, ports, to grow and sustain the trade industry and our global economy. When we invest in our infrastructure, we create a future future with good-paying jobs, a strong, thriving economy, and an efficient, safe transportation system. We have Americans who need work. We have an infrastructure that needs fixing. Let's bridge that gap.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition? Without objection, gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as a fifth-generation Montanan and sportsman, I know how special the Treasure State is. Our state's rivers and mountains and our outdoor heritage are an important part of every Montanan's way of life and play an important role in our state's economy. It's important that we work together to protect these valuable resources so that future generations can enjoy them for years to come. The North Fork watershed on the western slope of Glacier National Park is of critical value to our state's outdoor heritage and the tourism economy in the Flathead Valley. Efforts to protect the North Fork watershed, like the North Fork Watershed Protection Act, is a good example of how we can work together to put Montana first. That's why I'm introducing legislation to protect this valuable resource while also ensuring that current recreational uses, livestock management, and forest management in this region is maintained. I'm glad to be part of this important bipartisan effort and leading the charge in the House to achieve the goals that the Flathead community supports. Thank you, and I yield my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition? I'm sorry, California. Without objection, gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise today to ask Speaker Boehner to recognize that the time is now for this House to take up comprehensive immigration reform. I spent all of last week on an innovation roadshow. I went up and down Silicon Valley, and I have northern Silicon Valley in my district. I listened to the job creators, I listened to the innovators, and one message is clear. We have unfilled jobs here in America that require immigration fixes, require increase in the H-1B visas so that we can create jobs behind high-skilled immigrants. We know that Silicon Valley was built on a three-legged stool: access to capital, brain trust, and a risk-taking culture. And we know that immigrants build jobs behind them. They have that brain trust. They have that risk-taking culture. 40% of the largest companies in America were built by immigrants or the children of immigrants. It's time to also put the 11.5 million Americans in this country who are undocumented on a pathway to citizenship. I've been on the ground, I've talked to the innovators, and I hear their cry. The time is now. So for the sake of our economy and the sake of our communities, the right thing to do is to put these undocumented immigrants on a path to citizenship and to make sure that we can take high-skilled workers from across the world, put them in our country, and create thousands of new jobs behind them. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Last week, thousands of my constituents felt even more pain as a result of the President's sequestration when Toby Hanna Army Depot began to furlough over 5,000 of its civilian employees. One constituent called my office and asked, "How are we supposed to afford our mortgage if my husband is not allowed to work?" There must be a more logical way to cut the budget. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is what I would like to know. Why can the President jet around the country to play golf on the taxpayer's dime when the hardworking families cannot make ends meet? The House acted twice last year to replace the sequestration with more common-sense solutions, but the Senate refused to consider these bills. They even rejected a measure that would have given the administration more flexibility in implementing these cuts. Because of the President's insistence and the Senate's inaction, these families will now face even more financial uncertainty, struggling to pay their bills instead of earning a steady paycheck. Mr. Speaker, the people of the 10th Congressional District have had enough of the President's rhetoric, and they have certainly had enough of his sequestration. It's time that the President start working for the American people. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of a policy that allows federal agencies to determine whether it makes sense for certain construction projects to have project labor agreements, PLAs, which are agreements between owners, including federal agencies, and workers that establish worksite conditions. Federal agencies are currently empowered to consider PLAs as a means of reducing on-the-job conflicts, saving money, speeding up construction, and improving efficiency and worker safety. Unfortunately, this body will soon consider removing this tool from our construction toolbox. While they may not always be the answer on complex projects, PLAs make it more likely that a project will be done right the first time, and on budget. That's why some of the most successful companies in the world, including Boeing in my state, use a similar model for construction. It's why the Department of Energy uses a PLA at Hanford, and the Department of Defense has a PLA at the Explosive Handling Wharf in Kitsap County in my district. PLAs are open to all companies, union and non-union, who see the value of this tool. At a time when we're looking to rein in wasteful spending, PLAs can be a successful model in improving and promoting high-quality, cost-efficient construction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, last week I had the pleasure of spending time with first responders and public safety personnel in my district. I toured facilities in 7 counties, meeting with the men and women who are the first line of defense, the ones who go into danger rather than run away from it, the folks who are so critical to the safety of our citizens. I believe it's important for our first responders to know that their hard work and sacrifice are appreciated. As one final step of this tour, I'd like to extend my deepest appreciation and gratitude to all those whom I did not get to personally speak with last week. On behalf of South Carolina's 3rd District and Americans all across the country, we thank you for everything that you do. Mr. Speaker, it is also with great sadness that I rise today in honor of the fallen fire responders, many of whom are volunteers who gave their lives in Houston, Texas, and West Texas recently. May the members of this House honor the memory and the heroism of every first responder who has lost their lives serving this great nation. May God bless the families of the fallen, and I ask every American to remember them in your thoughts and prayers. May God continue to bless the United States of America with heroes such as these, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Delaware seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Delaware is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to discuss the urgent need to make college more affordable. As the father of a rising college freshman, I have renewed appreciation for the astronomical cost of college. On July 1st, the problem will get even worse. Interest rates on federal student loans are set to double. And that's why I co-sponsored the Student Loan Relief Act, which would extend the current lower rates for 2 more years. Last month, I voted against a proposal that would have increased rates with the extra money raised going to the federal government. Balancing the budgets on the backs of our college students is just plain wrong. The amount of money Americans owe in student loans is greater than the amount we owe in credit card debt. This is a serious problem with serious consequences, and it's getting worse. The future of our country, we know, depends on the ability of our young people to compete in this global economy. This means making it easier to go to college, not harder. I urge my colleagues to support legislation that will keep interest rates low and make college more affordable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay honor and tribute to 3 wonderful North Carolina heroes, Army Staff Sergeant Bobby Bridget and his neighbors back home, Steve and Pat Massa. Sergeant Bridget serves us in Afghanistan with 3 tours. During that time, his job was to go find IEDs and then take those IEDs and dismantle them to protect his fellow soldiers. Meanwhile, his neighbors back home, Pat and Steve Massa, they would take care of his lawn. They would do the errands around the house to make sure that their neighbor could go and serve his country and defend our freedoms. Well, the rest of the story is, Mr. Speaker, that the masses during this time are going through their own challenges. They had cancer surgeries, they had cancer treatments. A very difficult, emotional time, yet they did what it took to take care of their neighbor. We're grateful for the service of Sergeant Bridget, and particularly grateful for the wonderful neighbors that he had in the masses. May God richly bless these people. Thank you. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? Gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Yes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it has now been more than 2 months since across-the-board sequestration cuts were enacted, devastating so many important programs that Americans rely upon. Instead of working together to find compromise to fully reverse these automatic, indiscriminate spending cuts, House Republicans have voted for the Ryan budget, leaving these cuts in place and hurting our economy just to gain political points. This is not President Obama's sequestration. The GOP effort to make sequestration a reality shows they are ready and willing to take our economy backwards at a time when Americans are desperate to move the nation forward. In fact, sequestration will cost 750,000 jobs this year alone. House Democrats want sequestration repealed and replaced with a combination of revenue and cuts. The President has proposed $2 in spending cuts for every dollar of revenue, but Republicans remain dug in. Republicans refuse to address 70,000 children who could lose Head Start. They refuse to address the SNAP program, which is very important to feed elderly and children. Republicans refuse to address the cuts to NIH and other very important programs. We must work together. We must repeal sequestration.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purposes the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the visit a couple of weeks ago of Burma's president with the surrounding high-level honors was a little disturbing. This leader's regime has engaged in well-documented, horrific attacks against the various ethnic minority groups in his country, ethnic cleansing of minority tribes. When looking to the future of the country, President Thein Sein said last year that the ethnic youth should, quote, hold laptops and, quote, try to live a good life, end quote. Laptop computers are going to suddenly erase the effects of years of violence, racism, rape, and decimation by the ruthless military? I don't think so. We must stand firmly with the minority ethnic groups in protecting their rights and ensuring justice is done for all the violence perpetrated by the Burmese military before we rush into extracting resources and applauding democracy gains with no record of results. To the minority ethnic groups of Burma, many of us still stand with you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask consent to address the House for a minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as chair of the Climate Task Force in the House Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. June 1st marked the start of hurricane season, and this is a reminder that we must start planning ahead for extreme weather that we now face regularly, while also recognizing the cost of inaction. Taxpayers spent $136 billion on disaster relief in just the last 2 years. However, FEMA estimates that every $1 spent on planning, preparation, and prevention yields the nation $4 in future benefits. We are facing harsher droughts, deadlier heat waves, more severe storms, and in San Diego, increasingly intense wildfires. In 2012 alone, wildfires burned 9.2 million acres in the United States, an area larger than the states of Delaware, Rhode Island, and Connecticut combined. There is no clear national plan for how to make our society more resilient in the face of extreme weather. This is unacceptable, and we deserve better. Developing a planning structure for community resiliency is necessary. It will reduce federal spending, save lives, and it's what Washington could do more of. We must act now. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to serve in the House where we're continuing to work on the American people's priorities, encouraging job creation, growing our economy, and stopping policies that hurt American families. Already this year, we voted to create tens of thousands of jobs and move toward North American energy independence by passage of Keystone Pipeline legislation. We've also voted to save jobs from policies that hurt our economic growth by passing a budget that will balance in 10 years and repealing the President's health care law that is already costing jobs. In addition, we've worked to expand opportunities for all Americans by passing legislation that allows for a better trained workforce and removing barriers to help balance the needs of family time and work. Our focus is on solutions, not blame and excuses, to help encourage a healthy and prosperous economy, to create jobs, and to expand opportunities for all Americans. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, members, today I rise to honor the Houston firefighters who lost their lives and were injured battling a deadly five-alarm blaze. Every year, our Houston Firefighters Pension Board holds a memorial service to honor all firefighters, but especially those who gave their lives in the service as firefighters. I've attended many of those services over the years. Last Friday, May 31st, the deadliest fire in the 118-year history of the Houston Fire Department broke out in southwest Houston. Unfortunately, 4 brave Houston firefighters lost their lives performing their duties. Captain Matthew Renaud, engineer-operator Robert Beebe, firefighter Robert Garner, and firefighter Annie Sullivan tragically fell during the fire. Many firefighters were injured, including engineer-operator Anthony Livesay, EMT Robert Yarborough, EMT Foster Santos, engineer-operator and paramedic Marcos Hernandez, and Captain William Dowling. These firefighters were injured and died trying to save people in a motel unit. My heart and our prayers goes out to their families and friends. Being a grandson and nephew in a family of Houston firefighters, I understand the sacrifice their loved ones made. We shall never forget their heroic efforts to keep us safe. And I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Where are the jobs? I'll tell you where they're not. They're not created or seemingly even encouraged by the U.S. Department of Commerce. The Department is still bullying small mom-and-pop businesses to complete lengthy, time-consuming, and expensive questionnaires about their personal business. But they don't have time to answer my questions about the need, the justification, or the actual use of the information in those questionnaires. A letter received by a constituent just yesterday threatens that if they don't get their economic census back within 2 weeks, they will refer their case to General Counsel. How can constituents trust this agency when even the formerly independent IRS is now used as a partisan tool to punish people the administration does not like? If the Department of Commerce really cared about improving our commerce, they'd leave our mom and pops alone to make a living creating jobs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Hawaii seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, 41 years ago, President Nixon signed the landmark Title IX legislation into law, giving girls and boys equal opportunities in sports. But many people don't know is that there was a 5'2" Japanese-American woman from Hawaii who was behind this law. While she may not have been a contender for the WNBA, she laid the groundwork for women to participate in sports at every level. She was a fierce fighter for equal treatment and rights for women and held the seat in Congress which I'm privileged to hold today. Congresswoman Patsy Mink led the way to create equal opportunities for women and girls across the country with her landmark Title IX bill. She grew up wanting to be a doctor and was rejected from over a dozen medical schools in the 1940s simply for being a woman. She went on to attend law school and dedicated her life to battling the status quo. Title IX is a mere 37 words, but over the last 40 years it has made an incredible impact in the lives of young women around the country. Today girls can play basketball, volleyball, golf, tennis, or even football. Patsy opened the door for these opportunities. Many young women have walked through this door, paving the way for great athletes everywhere. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as many have heard me say on the floor of this chamber many times before, we have a tremendous opportunity to revitalize America's economy through domestic energy production. We can create jobs, lower energy costs, and become energy independent. We simply need to seize that opportunity. And to do that, we need this administration and its federal agencies to be partners in progress rather than roadblocks to prosperity. Job creation does not mean hiring more bureaucrats, and no should be the answer of last resort after all other avenues have failed. 2 weeks ago, the Department of Energy approved one of many requested permits to export liquefied natural gas. Given that a recent study showed that exporting liquid natural gas can lead to over 200,000 U.S. jobs, it's time for the Department of Energy to approve the rest of the applications and let the market drive our success. Cut the red tape for job creators. And if we embrace a path to energy independence, one that allows the market to pick winners and losers rather than Washington, D.C., we'll get our economy going again. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
Speaker, I am a strong advocate for the First Amendment and for the freedom of the press. I believe that there is no question of the sanctity of that provision, even to the extent of being a strong supporter of the SHIELD Act some many years ago, and now joining my colleague Congressman Ted Poe and John Conyers and others on legislation to provide that armor. But I will not stand by while malicious and unsubstantiated attacks go against a very fine and outstanding public servant, and that is the Attorney General of the United States of America, Eric Holder. I was in the Judiciary Committee when he was asked the question about whether or not he had intended to prosecute anyone in the press. And his words were very clear, that we've a long way to go to prosecute the press. You've got to go a long way. With regard to the potential prosecution of the press for the disclosure of material, that is not something I have been involved in or heard of or would think would be wise to do, Holder said in the hearing. Holder did not have anything to do with prosecuting anyone, and that particular affidavit or subpoena was in 2010. The Justice Department has not charged or prosecuted anybody in the press. Stop the malicious attack on Eric Holder and the President of the United States of America. Enough is enough.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Missouri seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to highlight the inexcusable actions taken by the IRS. Their decision to target conservative groups based on their political beliefs transcends party politics and represents an indefensible abuse of power. These actions indicate that the agency was operating with political agendas in mind and not the best interests of the American people, and that must change. We must refuse to tolerate this egregious behavior, and we must provide major oversight into the IRS so the American people remain protected and can trust that the tax code will treat them fairly. The American people demand answers, not just an apology from the IRS. That is why Congress and the House Ways and Means Committee and the Oversight and Government Reform Committee have led and will continue to lead vigorous and thorough investigations into this issue, seek out those responsible, and ensure that they are held accountable for their actions. Federal government officials should implement the law fairly, not abuse their power for political gain. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute. Revise extended.
Without objection, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life and memory of a true American hero, Captain Brandon L. Sear. Yesterday morning, I was humbled to attend Brandon's interment at Arlington National Cemetery. Standing on that hallowed ground, surrounded by Brandon and his fallen comrades, is a sobering testament to the sacrifice of those who gave their lives in the defense of freedom. Brandon was killed in the line of duty when the plane he was commanding was shot down over Afghanistan on April 27, 2013. A distinguished officer, accomplished pilot, and dedicated friend, Brandon received the Meritorious Service Medal, 5 Air Medals, and the Air Force Achievement Medal. At the time of his death, Brandon had logged 1,700 flight hours, 900 of those in combat. Brandon enters the honored company of those who, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, gave the last full measure of devotion so that this nation might live. It's with heartfelt gratitude that I recognize Brandon, his family, and American veterans and their families everywhere for their service and dedication to this nation. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition? Does the gentleman seek unanimous consent?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of 600 people in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who are earning smaller paychecks today because of Obamacare. Just last week, the largest school district in Indiana, Fort Wayne Community Schools, announced it would cut the hours of 610 part-time cafeteria workers and teachers' aides. These are hardworking folks who play a vital role in the education of our children. Officials running schools across Indiana and the nation are beginning to realize that these unsustainable costs are taking similar measures to comply with its mandates. Mr. Speaker, we know now that President Obama's claim that under Obamacare, if you like your health care, you can keep it, was false. Now we know that Obamacare is also hurting the very people it was meant to help. Employees in school districts across the country deserve certainty and security, and they don't have it. Americans are being crushed by the cost of the Affordable Care Act. We must repeal Obamacare and start over for the sake of Americans and our nation's children. Thank you. I'll yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Americans are struggling to find jobs in our economy. So we must take advantage of the opportunities for job growth where and whenever they arise. And today I want to highlight the positive economic impact of recreational fishing and hunting. Mr. Speaker, nationwide, sportsmen contribute over $3 billion of state and federal revenue annually through hunting and fishing licenses and fees and excise taxes. In my home state of North Carolina, hunters and anglers provide over 35,000 jobs. This is in 2011. More than the combined employment of the two largest private employers in the state. Sportsmen and women generated $249 million in state and local taxes in 2011, enough to support the salaries of over 6,000 police and sheriff's patrol officers. I rise today to support this important industry and what it is doing for my home state. Hunting, fishing, boating, and other recreational sports foster growth in our economy and create jobs. I yield back.
The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, sir. Pursuant to the permission granted in Clause 2H of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, the clerk received the following message from the Secretary of the Senate on June 4, 2013 at 11 o'clock a.m. that the Senate passed with an amendment, H.R. 588. Signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Any record vote on the postponed question will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 671 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 38, H.R. 671, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to improve the disability compensation evaluation procedure of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs for veterans with mental health conditions related to military sexual trauma and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michoud, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days with which to revise and amend their remarks and add any extraneous material they may have on H.R. 671 as amended.
Without objection.
And I yield myself such time as I might consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 671 as amended will demand that the Department of Veterans Affairs place an immediate and concerted focus upon updating and improving its regulations for processing claims based upon military sexual trauma, commonly known as MST. Reported incidents of military sexual trauma have risen markedly in recent years, a disturbing trend affecting both women and men serving in the military. I have spoken with many service members who have suffered MST, and one sentiment is commonly echoed. These service members feel a sense of betrayal and trust. They have said that they feel betrayed by their fellow military attacker.
and without proper handling of the crime. They also feel betrayed by their command and their service branch. The Department of Defense must take the lead on this issue and must address military sexual assault and trauma through the ranks in the strongest possible terms. Additionally, our veterans who have suffered military sexual trauma, who live with this sense of betrayal, must be confident that they will not be further traumatized by the Department of Veterans Affairs when they seek the necessary and proper assistance. Survivors of MST must not be subjected to outdated and antiquated regulations of the Department. VA's approach to claims of MST and its processing thereof require immediate and thoughtful review, and that is the intent of H.R. 671 as amended. I want to thank Congresswoman Pingree for bringing this important bill to the committee, and I commend the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Runyon, and the ranking member Titus for their bipartisan work in bringing this bill to the floor today. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wholeheartedly support H.R. 671, the Ruth Moore Act of 2013. This bill was introduced by my colleague and good friend of mine from the state of Maine, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, and is named after a constituent of mine, Ruth Moore. This important legislation seeks to better serve those men and women who have become victims of military sexual trauma. This legislation makes clear that we expect the VA to update its regulation in regards to the military sexual trauma, which we believe are outdated and do not reflect the need of those who are living through this awful experience. This bill would encourage the VA to update its regulation to ensure that military sexual trauma is specified as an in-service stressor, and that those updated regulations also recognize the full range of physical and mental disabilities that may result. Mr. Speaker, VA did the right thing by our Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange by updating their regulations. And we expect VA to also do the right thing by veterans who have been suffering from military sexual trauma. H.R. 671, as amended, contains language to ensure VA follows through on the requirement to do better by those who have suffered military sexual trauma. It will dramatically increase the reporting requirements of VA in the event that these regulations are not updated within 15 months in an appropriate manner. Let's be clear. Congress disagrees with VA's assessment of MST to being adjudicated effectively. We expect VA to take a good, hard look at this issue and update its regulation in a timely fashion. We will be watching and will be having oversight hearings to make sure that the reporting requirements are upheld. And I'd urge my colleagues to support passage of H.R. 671, the Ruth Moore Act. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield as much time as he might consume to the Subcommittee Chairman of Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Runyon.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Miller, for yielding my time. H.R. 671, as amended, is known as the Ruth Moore Act of 2013. As Chairman of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, I am pleased once again that our subcommittee worked in a productive and bipartisan manner on this important bill for our nation's service members. I also applaud the leadership shown by Ms. Pingree in sponsoring this legislation. Military sexual trauma is a terrible act, a betrayal of trust, and it is not to be tolerated. Furthermore, those veterans who were victimized by their fellow service members are entitled to VA assistance, and they are entitled to a fair and thoughtful review, or thoughtful review of their claims. Thus, H.R. 671, as amended, sets stringent reporting requirements and urges the Department of Veterans Affairs to make necessary changes to their regulations on military sexual trauma to ensure their fair review. I strongly support H.R. 671 as amended, and I urge my colleagues to also support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
We reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman, the author of the bill from my home state of Maine, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree.
The gentlelady from Maine is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to thank my colleague from Maine, Mr. Michoud, for his time, for his leadership on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and for sharing his brave constituent Ruth Moore with me. I also wanted to thank Chairman Miller for his bipartisan work on this bill, as well as Subcommittee Chair Mr. Runyon and Ms. Titus, the ranking member, for their work on this issue as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, lately it has been hard to escape the news about the crisis of sexual assault in the military. Senior military personnel charged with preventing sexual assault are themselves investigated or arrested for the very same thing. A new Pentagon report showing 26,000 men and women were sexually assaulted in the military last year, up 35%. And only about 1 in 10 of those assaults were reported, and even fewer ended up with prosecution. In fact, the Pentagon says that every single week, 400 sexual assaults go unreported. But even though we've heard much more about this problem lately, in no way is it a new problem. Almost every day I hear from another veteran who is the survivor of sexual assault in the military. Men and women of all ages, from every branch of the service, from every era. I have heard of survivors of sexual assault from World War II, the war in Afghanistan, and every conflict and every era in between. There is no question. We have to get to the root of the problem. We have to reform the legal system and change the culture so sexual assault in the military is no longer tolerated and is thoroughly prosecuted. But the sad fact remains, even if sexual assaults in the military ended today, even if a woman or man in uniform was never raped again, there would still be tens of thousands of veterans who survived a sexual assault and suffer a disability because of it, but still can't get veterans' disability benefits that they are owed. That's why we need this bill, the Ruth Moore Act. This bill doesn't create any new benefits for survivors of sexual assault. This bill doesn't give any special treatment to the survivors of sexual assault. This bill just levels the playing field and makes it easier for those survivors to get the benefits they are owed. A few years ago, the Department of Veterans Affairs acknowledged that too many combat veterans were suffering from PTSD and they were being denied benefits because it was too difficult to document what happened to them on the battlefield. So the VA made a common sense change. They said, if you were in combat and a VA doctor gives you a diagnosis of PTSD, and if an examiner links that diagnosis to the combat you experienced, then you are eligible for benefits. The Ruth Moore Act just asked the VA to do the same thing for victims of military sexual assault. If a VA doctor gives a veteran a diagnosis of mental health condition and there is a medical link to the sexual assault then the VA will have to qualify the veteran for service-related disability benefits. Currently, the VA requires secondary markers to show the sexual assault occurred. Those secondary markers, statements from relatives or friends or a supervisor, are often hard to come by, especially for veterans who suffered an assault years or even decades ago. In the case of combat-related PTSD, those secondary markers are no longer required, and the sworn statement of the veteran is sufficient. The same reform should apply to survivors of sexual assault. We named this bill for a very brave woman from Maine. Ruth Moore was in the Navy when she was 19, serving her country. At a base in the Azores, she was raped, and when she reported it, she was told to keep quiet, and then she was raped again. For 23 years, she fought for the benefits she was owed. Her records were tampered with, she was diagnosed with mental illness, and her life fell apart. After decades of fighting, Ruth was finally given the benefits we owed her, and slowly she has put her life back together. When I met her in my office in Maine 2 years ago, she could barely tell her story. Her friends, her neighbors, even many of her loved ones didn't know what had happened to her. But bit by bit, Ruth has rebuilt her trust of people in positions of responsibility to the point where she came here to Washington and testified before the Veterans Committee. A very brave woman. But there are thousands and thousands of Ruth Moores out there who have been fighting for their benefits for years or even for decades. As survivors of sexual assault, they have suffered and sacrificed enough. We can make the process of getting the benefits they are owed a little bit simpler. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Continue to reserve. We have no further speakers.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Negrete McLeod.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Michaud. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of H.R. 671, the Ruth Moore Act of 2013. This bill specifies military sexual trauma as a type of stressor for post-traumatic stress disorder. This is an important step toward assuring that the VA gives full consideration for disability claims originating from sexual violence committed against military personnel while they serve our country. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 671 and a member of the Military Sexual Assault Prevention Caucus, I believe we must support our veterans who may confront challenges upon returning to civilian life. This includes obtaining compensation for violence committed by a fellow service member. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, we are ready to close if the ranking member is ready as well.
Yes. Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today we can take a meaningful step to ensure VA better serves veterans who are subject to sexual trauma while serving in our military. These veterans' disability were not a result from fire, from the enemy. They were not a result of injury incurred during training. They are a result of the armed services' continual failure to systematically address the culture of sexual assault in the military. This situation is unacceptable and unconscionable. We must act. With this legislation, we hope to ensure the VA helps these disabled veterans. We have a duty to make these men and women's lives a little better. They never should have had to deal with these events in the service of our nation anyway. So, Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation. I also want to thank the chairman of the full committee and the chairman of the subcommittee for their hard work in bringing this bill before the floor for us to vote on today, as well as the committee staff. I know the committee staff on both sides of the aisle have worked very hard to amend this bill so it's acceptable to both sides of the aisle. So I do want to thank my chairman for all his hard efforts, not only in this legislation, but also on legislation as it affects veterans and their families throughout the country. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, so I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I think the words speak for themselves, the comments that have been made here on the floor. I would just close with this, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the Ruth Moore Act. I support H.R. 671 as amended and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 671, as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the title is amended. Who's going to be managing over here? Florida. Gentleman from Florida seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 243 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 29, House Resolution 243, resolved that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 2216, making appropriations for military construction, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Points of order against provisions in the bill for failure to comply with Clause 2 of Rule 21 are waived. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair of the Committee of the Whole may accord priority and recognition on the basis of whether the member offering an amendment has caused it to be printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose in Clause 8 of Rule 18. Amendments so printed shall be considered as read. When the committee rises and reports the bill back to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass, the previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion, except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2. At any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 2217, making appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Points of order against provisions in the bill for failure to comply with Clause 2 of Rule 21 are waived, except for Section 563. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair of the Committee of the Whole may accord priority and recognition on the basis of whether the member offering an amendment has caused it to be printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose in Clause 8 of Rule 18. Amendments so printed shall be considered as read. When the committee rises and reports the bill back to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass, the previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3. Pending the adoption of a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2014, the provisions of House Concurrent Resolution 25, as adopted by the House, shall have force and effect in the House as though Congress has adopted such concurrent resolution, and the allocations of spending authority printed in Tables 11 and 12 of House Report 113-17 shall be considered for all purposes in the House to be the allocations under Section 302A of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes. My friend and colleague, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, pending which I yield the balance of my time to which I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the rule and the 2 underlying